Well, welcome back to Inside Personal Growth. This is Greg Voisin, the host of Inside Personal Growth. And I have Joe Sprangel joining us. And Joe has a book out called Humanist Manufacturing, a humanitarian approach to excellence in high impact plant operations. And what we want to say to all our listeners, it's not just for that. It's really across the board, being humanist and a better humanist leader. Okay. And Joe, good day to you.
Thank you. Good day to you as well. I'm happy to
Appreciate
join you
that.
today.
Well, and you are joining us from where?
In Stanton, Virginia, in the heart of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia.
Beautiful part of the country. Thanks for taking this time to impart some of your wisdom on our listeners about this. And I'm really looking forward to this. So let me let our listeners know a little bit about you. Joe, it's Dr. Joe Sprangel, DBA, is an associate professor of business at Mary Baldwin University. He's also the founder and principal consultant of Emmanuel Strategic Sustainability. That's the website we're going to have a link to, so all of you can go there to learn more about Joe and his teaching. He blends his academic and industrial background to redefine the role of manufacturing to an industry and effectively and efficiently balances environmental, financial, and social success that leads to more inclusive and sustainable local economies for all community members. He's a fascinating individual, and he's earned his Doctor of Business Administration degree from Lawrence Technical University. He also holds a Master of Business Administration degrees from Spring Arbor University, Spring Arbor, and a Bachelor of Business Administration from Eastern Michigan University, and an associate degree in mechanical engineering technology. So you're speaking with someone that knows what he's talking about here. Joe, to kind of kick this off, you wrote this book to bring more of a humanistic approach to manufacturing. And I want to say to everybody listening, don't let the word manufacturing discourage you from listening to this podcast, because this is really more about being more humanistic in the whole organization. Can you tell our listeners a bit about your background and why you believe shifting the focus to being more humanistic will result in greater productivity in the workplace?
So I spent nearly 30 years in manufacturing shortly after I got out of high school. And I began at the laborer level, and eventually I worked up to various maintenance, engineering, and supervisory positions. And ultimately I was in a role of a plant manager for a few different operations. And simultaneously, I was also attending college in evenings and weekends, and I earned business and engineering degrees from an associate to a doctorate, like you mentioned, while working full time. So the great thing is that allowed me to apply what I was learning right away, and I really enjoyed that aspect of going that way. And then I tell people jokingly that I had a midlife crisis, decided to become an academic. I didn't really have one, but it always makes for a better story, right? So, but I transitioned to higher ed for the last 15 years, of which 5.5 years I was a dean. And the balance of that, I've been teaching undergraduate and graduate courses. And as I studied, and both in the university settings and just reading trade publications and so forth, I really had a focus on what I call organizational excellence. I was into change management, leadership principles, management, strategy, and so forth throughout my career. I always wanted to be part of one of those best plants that Industry Weeks does, or the Shingo Prize or something like that. And while I didn't accomplish that, I feel like now I'm trying to help other organizations achieve maybe my dream. So working vicariously through them.
Well, and you're still teaching, yeah? You're still teaching. And I think it's, I think our listeners have heard about the humanistic approach. There's when you look at corporations, you can look at the balance sheet. What is the human capital balance sheet of a business? And we look at human capital. We don't often realize, business owners, how important that element is, because when you list your assets on the balance sheet, it's like hard plant, equipment, and all this stuff that you own, right? But when you realize that if you have turnover, high turnover in a business, and especially in manufacturing, which it does seem to occur more likely there, maybe at a place like Amazon, where people are being pushed to get packages, to get things in boxes and so on, and go down assembly lines, you have that. You gave a list of manufacturing companies that have been exemplars, and have laid the foundation for others. Can you comment on some of these leaders and what they did differently to be focused on this human element at work? I think sometimes always real examples are more important than anything.
Yeah. So commonality between all these leaders was they embraced the power of business to create a better world. And as a result, they gave their workforces kind of a unifying purpose, or what Simon Sinek has called the why.
Mm-hmm.
And it really helps to develop a deeper level of employee engagement. And his TED Talk on why has been viewed over 61 million times. So it's certainly, the concept resonates with people. And but
And
each of
on
them
and
was
just to insight, just on my little show, he's had over 250,000 downloads about the interview
wow.
I did with him on why. So, and you can see why he's had, what'd you say, 9 million? Is that what you said?
No, it said it's been viewed 61 million times.
61 million times. So I
Yeah.
added to that. I added to that. So go ahead. I'm sorry that I interrupted you, but I want to let my listeners know there is a podcast with Simon Sinek on Inside Personal Growth. So
That's
yeah,
right. Good,
yeah.
good to know. But each of them has also been a trailblazer, kind of following a path less traveled, I would say. So Ray Anderson was the founder and CEO of Interface. Unfortunately, he's passed away since, but he had a spear in the chest epiphany after reading The Ecology of Commerce, with a Declaration of Sustainability by Paul Hawken. And that led him on a path to taking Interface to becoming initially a zero impact company. And right now they're working on becoming a regenerative manufacturing operation. And then Mary Barra is one that I profiled, and I've just been amazed with the work that she's done at General Motors and what they're doing right now to help create a safer, greener, and better world. And then,
And what about you, Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia? What would you say about him? I've seen him.
yeah,
He doesn't speak a lot before a lot of groups,
right.
but I've read his book, Let Them Play, or whatever it's called. But he's a fascinating man who started this a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, he was a mountain climber that I think he described himself as becoming an accidental business owner. That wasn't his plan when he started out.
Right.
And one of the things that he found is that by making these decisions that were best for the planet, ultimately they also positively impacted the bottom line. And that wasn't ultimately of the importance to him. Obviously, he wanted to have a viable organization. But his first focus was, what can we do as an outdoor apparel company and equipment supplier to make sure that we're not harming the environment, which we enjoy so much. And so
Right.
he created this, purpose for his organization that gets people to to want to work for the organization. People feel good about buying their product because they know, A, it's going to work well. B, it's coming from a company that has values that align with them as well. So,
And from a manufacturing standpoint, he also used to put out ads, and he still does. If you have a jacket and you don't need this, don't buy my jacket, right?
right,
And
exactly.
and I really don't think that was a ploy to get people to buy
No,
his jacket. I
nope,
really believe he sincerely believed that. Some people say it's greenwashing, he just did it. But the point is that he was saying, look, the energy that it takes to manufacture a jacket and get the supplies and all the rest of the stuff, when you look cradle to cradle, right? If you
yeah,
look at your closet, like I've looked at mine, and I'm using this as an example, I probably got 10 or 12 jackets in there, right? Do I really need another Patagonia jacket, right? And then the question is, do I trade mine in? Because he's got a
yeah,
program where you can actually go and kind of recycle these
yeah, exactly.
these jackets. I believe that's extremely smart.
Yeah. Well, for him, it's not greenwashing because the man just put the entire company into a trust to protect the environment moving
Right,
forward, right? So
right,
he's not worried about money.
right.
Yvonne Chenard is not going to be having problems with that. But
Uh,
he's used business in a manner that is now going to be perpetually helping to create profits that will then also benefit the environment. So
well,
it's really
socially
cool.
responsible. And I think when you
Exactly.
talk about manufacturing and people, um, there's a guy called, it's a nonprofit called Clean the World. Now, it's a great manufacturing story for you. We manufacture all these bars of soap that go into these hotels, and people only use them once.
Exactly.
And then they throw them into boxes, and this guy takes 2,500 pounds a day and he recycles them and makes them into soap that can be used by the homeless, and he sends them all around the world, right?
Yeah, great.
And I keep thinking to myself, it's like there's this whole process to grind them and put them on the manufacturing line and then resent them, and they come in these every day. They get thousands and thousands of pounds of these soaps from Marriott and all these places. And you
Yeah.
look at it and you go, that is socially responsible at its very core,
Yeah.
right? And I loved it. In your book, you outlined 6 phases of humanistic manufacturing. Um, I'd like for you to briefly mention the 6 phases because
Okay.
we don't have time in a 40-minute podcast to cover everything, but we're going to I'll let my listeners, well, we'll get to them, and then give the 10 humanistic commitments of living humanistic values.
Okay.
And I think if we did that, and then I've got more questions that lead in and follow into that.
All righty. Well, it starts out with phase one, where we look at the humanist commitments that are listed in the book that you mentioned, and looking at them from a perspective of better understanding them, adopting them, and then integrating those into the organization. And, are these something that can align with what a business owner or leader is trying to accomplish? And then moving to the second phase, where I recommend an owner or a leader actually kind of does a self-assessment of their leadership approach and what is their current vision, mission, and values, and how do they align with the commitments? And is there? And as we go through different phases of our life, our career, something that might have been important when somebody started a company might be different now, and just kind of having this moment of reflection to say, okay, you know, here's where I am today. Here's what's going to be important for me moving ahead. And then to repeat that process with the executive team so that ultimately you end up with this really highly cohesive and effective leadership group. And then I put a lot of focus on robust internal operations in phase three. And really what that is that we want our employees to be successful in the essential work that they carry out organizational wide. Make sure our customers are cared for, that we care for each other, that both internal and then external stakeholders as well. And then phase four is to develop what, is an employee-centric workforce where each member of the team, the organization as a whole, can move towards reaching their full human potential. I've been at so many organizations where we just use a fraction of what people can bring to the table. And I've seen so many examples where when organization leadership starts to utilize employees in this manner, they find out that they have so much more capability than they ever dreamed that they would have. And then 5 is going in and determining, well, what's going to be our place in our community? What's the impact that we can have to create a positive opportunity to help create thriving community ecosystem for us. And so examples of that could be maybe we hire people on the autism spectrum that 85% of them are unemployed, but yet they have tremendous talent that could be utilized. In different things like that, instead of using up resources and leaving an abandoned factory behind, we're actually somebody that's committed to creating thriving with those that are part of the community in which we live. And then 6 is taking all of this knowledge and then working through developing a strategy and then working through the tactical plans and then all of the change management plans that are required of that. And it's been kind of my experience, a lot of people can't, or I shouldn't say can't, they just they don't walk through that in a really strong logical process that, you have books on leadership, you have books on change management and so forth. But part of why I wrote this book was to say, okay, here's where you are today, status quo. Here's where you might want to be 5 years from now. And this is what I see as the steps or the phases to help accomplish that role.
Well, it gives people a great opportunity to kind of think of this as a model and all those phases. And you can see how they all interplay with one another the way you explained them. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
But, in phase 2, because we're going to get into a little bit deeper here, you focus on leadership development and how do leaders embrace, hopefully I don't mispronounce this, the Ubuntu philosophy, which is, and the why is it so important to shifting the entire culture to this. First, explain the word and the origin of the word. If I mispronounced it, repronounce it. And then how do you get this entire cultural shift?
Yeah. Well, and I may pronounce it wrong as well, but Ubuntu philosophy, it's an African belief that we are selfhood to others, that, no one man or woman is an island. And kind of, right now we have kind of this me generation, and, it just kind of goes counter to what I think is a good organizational culture. And William E. Flippin Jr. was an advocate for justice, communism, and grassroots organization, where he saw it as a deeply personal philosophy that calls on us to mirror our humanity to each other. And ultimately it means that we're treating each other with openness, personal dignity, unquestioning cooperation, warmth, and willing participation. And wouldn't we all want to work in that sort of environment, right? And so Bob Chapman is one of the people that I profiled in the book, and he moved his organization, Barry Waymiller, from what they called a we-centric organization into a me-centric organization into a we-centric one, where they treat everybody like family. They realize that the better they treat their employees, the more productive they are. The employees are also going to have a better life when they leave the place, because they're not going to go home angry, frustrated, tired, feeling like they've been abused all day. And so it really is just shifting to, we're all in this together. We should be doing this in a manner that helps one another, that lifts everybody up. And, that's the kind of organization I'd like to work in. And I know I've worked at my best when I had that sort of situation going.
Well, it's refreshing to see that organizations, whether manufacturing or not, are embracing these shifts in consciousness associated to have a better work environment, because they realize that the people that are working in them, as we've evolved as a species and society, aren't willing to accept the old ways we used to work, which was command and control.
Exactly.
And, I know Daniel Goldman has not been on our show, but everybody knows emotional intelligence from Daniel Goldman. And, you talk about it in the book, and you say that leaders with greater EI, emotional intelligence, and are that they're better at leading, right? They're better at leading.
Right.
What are some of the other benefits that we get from people that are more emotionally intelligent leaders, other than just the fact that, hey, I know I just did one on experiential intelligence, right?
Okay.
And it was a podcast that was done, and it was fascinating, because you just said 2 minutes ago, you don't even know the people you're working with and what they bring to the workplace. And they bring all these series of experiences in life that can really help the organization evolve and certain elements of it evolve. And I want to talk about emotional intelligence, but I think that whole experiential intelligence thing, it's another whole factor that's important.
Yeah. So, a lot of the benefits that come out of being more emotionally intelligent is that we can be more empathetic during difficult conversations that are inevitable when you're going through a change process. It helps us to manage our emotions and those of our coworkers, in particular during stressful and overwhelming situations. people always wonder how I could stay so calm. Well, I probably wasn't completely calm on the inside, but I realized that, if the leader of the organization runs around like a chicken with his head cut off, everybody's going to start doing that. That's not going to get anybody anywhere. It's also helpful in resolving conflict resolution, because if people understand that we are empathetic, they might be more willing to open up to us, and helps us to motivate and coach our workforce. It increases employee collaboration potential and psychological safety that's so important if you want to make the kind of change we're talking about, becomes more likely in this type of environment. And ultimately, if we understand the emotions that precede thought, it's critical to help ourselves and others to improve themselves. And we're more likely to achieve more tremendous success in our personal and professional lives if we are led and can develop stronger emotional intelligence across our organization.
Yeah, I really love the terminology and the work that Goldman did around emotional intelligence. And I always look at it, I know if we're going to heal this world and heal our businesses and heal society in general, that's going to happen as a result of people becoming more compassionate with one another. If we all could learn, and people are going to say, well, you're talking about the Dalai Lama. Yeah, the Dalai Lama talks about being more compassionate overall, right? But the reality is that's the truth. I mean, you and I on a previous call talked about Herb Kelleher and Southwest Airlines and his whole love thing, right? Well, most businesses don't want to mention the word love in it. So if you're not going to mention the word love in it because you think it's too woo-woo, then you better be thinking about how emotionally intelligent your leaders are and how compassionate those leaders can be to listen and understand the needs of the people who are working for you, so you don't have turnover as a result of having somebody who doesn't understand those things. And we've all heard of this. You and I were just speaking about Simon Sinek before we got on the call. And it's the whole why thing, the mission, vision, values, purpose, the why of our business. Why do we exist? Why does this business do what it does? Can you give some examples of manufacturing businesses that have successfully shifted their culture by focusing on the why they have existed? Now, we did talk a little bit about Yvon Chouinard just a minute ago, but there are others besides Yvon Chouinard. I remember Zappos Shoes. He's no longer with us. He died in a fire in a home, but Tony was really big on the why Zappos existed, which is why who the hell would ever thought we would have bought a pair of shoes off the internet, right?
Yeah.
But that's a good example. Tell us some others though, Joe.
Okay. Yeah, one of the wonderful gifts that I had while I was writing this book was a man named Fred Keller, who's the founder and chairman of Cascade Engineering in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He said he was a child of the 60s looking to live up to the principles of having a business to work for everyone. And so as I went through this process, I would, I ran the phases by him. I ran the initial draft of the book and so forth. And what really resonated well for me is that he said, hey, you got it. This is what I was doing as I was developing my organization. And so some of the things that they have done is that, anti-racism was important to them. They'd implemented diversity, equity, and inclusion long before it became a recent emphasis to be, a politically correct standard practice. They're one of the largest B Corps in the world. They had a program called Be Nice. I think they still do, I should say. And they're committed to mental health assistance to their employees and families through a 4-step action plan. They hire people that are what they call returning citizens, somebody that's done previous time for being incarcerated for, some sort of mistake that they made. I don't know about you, but, I've made mistakes in my life where probably I could have ended up in prison. Thankfully, I didn't. But imagine only, being judged on the one significant mistake you made, that you can't find work after that. They found that, hey, we get great employees by allowing this opportunity. They're definitely veteran friendly. They've committed to helping people transition out of the military career into the manufacturing industry. And then they have a program called Welfare to Career, where they look at what can they do to help move people out of a poverty situation into a meaningful career. We often in our society, we give people enough to get by. And then if they want to make a difference in their lives, then we cut them off and they can't bridge that gap between, okay, I want to get off of assistance, but I can't afford to get to work because I don't have a car and so forth. Well, they put programs in place to help people to be able to get to that job and to eventually get to a point where, okay, now I'm okay. I'm over the other side of that bridge and I can move forward.
Sounds
They
like a
focus
great
on
company
diversity
to,
for women and so forth. So,
yeah, it looks like they looked at everything, right?
yeah.
They really did a good job of it. It reminds me of an interview that occurred quite some time ago, but if you've not heard of this company in Michigan called Zingerman's Deli,
Oh yeah. Well learned.
Ari Weinzig, right? Weinzig. And I'm going to let all of my listeners know because I think it's a perfect example in one of our podcasts, because I did two with him, that I learned so much about how he shifted the culture of what would normally be just a normal old deli, right? But
Yep.
turned it into a multi-million dollar operation, and then
Yep.
wrote books about his management style and philosophy. So it's another great example of how you have good emotional intelligence, how you use your why and your purpose to get your people behind you so that things coalesce into something wonderful, right?
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
You say in phase 3 of your 6 phases, you talk about building overall operations. And I don't want to miss out on this because operations are operations on an assembly line and they're operations inside anywhere in a company. What does it mean and how do companies build an effective business operating system? You call it a BOS.
Yeah.
I remember the guy he's got the EOS, entrepreneur operating system, but what is the BOS?
Well, I don't think I've coined a new term there, but for me, it kind of brings to mind Dr. W. Edwards Deming and his 14 points of management. He had a particular quote that resonated with me is that a bad system will beat a good person every time. And I've experienced that. I've been in places where, it seemed like the proverbial three ring circus where you'll be the next person the owner fires because you couldn't turn water into wine or turn a sow's ear into a silk purse. And, what happens is that they don't put a really strong, robust system in place, like in the Toyota production system, some know it as lean manufacturing, where they don't attribute failures to breakdowns in individuals or the fault of an individual. They attribute it to a breakdown in the process. And if you don't have strong, robust processes, then you can't do the things that ultimately delight your customers and allow you to carry out what is important for you as an organization. And so for me, it's kind of a combination of the B impact assessment by B Lab, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Deming's principles, and the Toyota production system. And it's going to be a little different for every organization, but to me, it's kind of bringing those different elements together in a way that allows us as an organization to carry out our business in the most efficient and effective manner.
Yeah, the Toyota, I was sent a couple of books by a gentleman who their company was chosen by Toyota to actually win an award for that processing.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the pleasure of meeting him. He was in Denver and has a huge window manufacturing company. And Toyota chose to work with them, which I thought was kind of interesting because I didn't even know they did that. But, my listeners, probably of all listeners, are, if they are, they're familiar with the Betterment Corporation, the B Corp. And in manufacturing, what impact would you say this B impact assessment would have on overall operations? And what shifts are you seeing in organizations focused on social and environmental impact that they have on the world? Because, to get a Betterment Corporation you just can't go out and get the designation. You first have to start off. I think you have to be in business a year, at least 2
Right.
years, to actually get that certification or to actually apply as a betterment company. But there are a lot of betterment companies out there. What do you see happening on the manufacturing side and the non-manufacturing side?
Yeah. So Cascade Engineering is the largest B Corp in the world, or one of them, I shouldn't say, not the largest, but and a lot of what I see in that movement is led me to one really critical conclusion. And when you combine this for-profit and nonprofit, the best of each together, you end up with some are calling the for-benefit sector. It's really an attractive employment option for Gen Z and our younger millennial groups, and even old guys like me. That the company still wants to make a profit, but they're doing it with an environmental or social purpose. And so Chenard, they were one of the first people that lined up to be a certified B Corp. And they in essence, what we're trying to do is do well while doing good. And so somebody works for a company, you're making industry wages as opposed to what sometimes are lesser in the nonprofit world. But it really excites people because they're doing something that, for whatever purpose that they have, they're helping someone every day in the work that they do each day that they're employed. And an example of this is I had a great opportunity to spend some time at a company called Impact Makers, and Michael Perron states that they're kind of the IT and management consulting business that's the B2B version of Newman's Own, where they put all their profits towards charitable organizations. And while they're not in manufacturing, what I found in the recurring theme of the interviews with these people that were the various stakeholders, so employees, management team, their customers, their board members, and so forth, was just this great pride in the work that they were doing because they knew they were helping the community. And so they had this really defined why, and it allowed them to be able to say, okay, we're not just saying we're doing this, we actually have verification that we are the type of company that's making a difference in the community where we operate.
And I see more and more people, even smaller businesses, headed that way, Joe.
Right.
They're really realizing, you can't blame this on COVID, but a lot of people said COVID was kind of this jolt that many people and many organizations needed to really understand this.
Yeah.
And I would agree it was one of the jolts, but I think it had been leading up to it. There'd been so many changes in our world that created it, and just an optimal opportunity to embrace it. And you talk about cradle to cradle design and the specific impacts that this innovation has on manufacturing. Also, could you give the listeners some examples of organizations that are really doing a good job in cradle to cradle design that's having a reduced impact on the environment? I know for a fact that, I look at Apple and I say, okay, Apple's got a great return policy. Where does all that go?
Right.
So, I turn in a computer. Does it end over up in Taiwan and somebody rips out all the chips and the component parts to remanufacture another iPad or iPhone or something? But, this whole cradle to cradle design thing is so important when you look at packaging, when you look at and everything, and everybody's focused on packaging. And
Yeah.
I'm like, well, yeah, you're focused on packaging, but what about the frickin' product that comes in the package?
Yeah.
Where does that go afterwards?
Yeah. So yeah, this cradle to cradle design is the shift from linear consumption where we just use something and then we trash it. I think in 6 months we dispose of most everything we purchase. There's very few things that last beyond that 6 month cycle. And in cradle to cradle design, they're looking at things like a biological cycle or a technological cycle. The biological designs are things that are naturally biodegradable, like I don't know if you remember the Sun Chips bag from many years ago. It was compostable. They thought it was going to be a great idea. It wasn't well received because it made a lot of noise. But technical designs reutilize chemicals, metals, and oil-based materials that are reused and recycled in a closed system. And so an example of this is Interface, who's, again, one of the companies that I profiled. They actually receive all of their used carpet back that people are willing to send
Yeah.
them. And
Anderson was a leader in that. He was.
Oh, yeah. He's kind of became my, I don't have many heroes, but Ray Anderson is one of them. So.
Ray Anderson really was to so many people. I mean, he was phenomenal. And when I worked with Larry Wilson at Wilson Learning, we always used the Ray Anderson story around how he recycled the backs of carpeting and the fibers in the carpeting, right?
Yep.
And, for that time, because I'm going about 15, 20 years, that was really a monumental kind of thing to do. Because most people would just end up in the dump, right? And bury it in the ground.
A lot of this started in the mid 90s when most people didn't even know what sustainability was. And
right.
You're definitely a pioneer.
Yeah.
But they're now a third-party carbon neutral enterprise. So, they neutralize their carbon impact across their operations, across all the avenues of their business, and even throughout their value chain. And now they're working on being a regenerative organization where their factory will positively contribute to a forest, for example, using biomimicry design. And H2 Green Steel is another example in Boden, which is in northern Sweden. They're a company that's working to produce green steel that reduce the CO2 emissions by up to 95%, when compared to traditional steel making. So water and heat become their primary emissions by replacing coal with green hydrogen, for example, instead of fossil fuel electricity. So they're just a couple of many examples of companies.
How many would you say, Joe? Because you got your finger on the pulse here. Usually when you get in government involved in this to create legislation that forces somebody to do something, it's taken them a long time to actually change their ways. Do you see many of these people now willing to shift their ways without compliance to some rule from the EPA or some other governmental body organization that's saying, hey, you've got to go here, or they finally realize that they're losing consumers because they're manufacturing a certain way, and we have more people that are environmentally sensitive and want to buy products like that? I mean, what would you say overall is going on? Because it just seems so challenging to get your head around.
Yeah, sadly, it's still not the norm. There are these leading exemplars that have started to implement this into their manufacturing operations. Part of it's, in the book, I talk about a lot of different challenges that companies face. And, I've been in so many companies where, they just were doing everything they could to survive from one day to the next. Maybe they don't have good cash flow and so on and so forth. But smart companies start to figure out, well, what can I do to save a little money here and then put some of that aside? And then, and it's talk about, in the book about eating that elephant, right? You got to eat it one bite at a time. You can't go from where I'm at today to being wholly sustainable overnight. It's going to take time, takes money, takes effort. And, but it's certainly possible. These are all companies that are examples that show that, yeah, you can accomplish this if you want to.
Without investing billions into retooling the whole manufacturing plant, an example you just said was reutilizing, let's just say, the cutting oil from a machine, an actual machine that's a what do they call them? CDC machine,
CNC.
CNC. Yeah. So out here in California, I worked with a lot of people that had CNC machines, and you'd see all that cutting oil going back through there, and they're making bolts and they're making things for aircraft and they're making, whatever it is that they're making, right? But is that an example? Just let's take that one little example of things that people can actually use and recycle pretty effectively before they dump it down the drain, or they have some environmental agency come and pick it up in a 55-gallon drum and haul it off somewhere. Because None of us really knows where hospital waste goes. None of us really knows where CDC machining stuff goes. The average person listening out there doesn't have a clue. And I would probably be one of them because I know that there are huge companies, Joe, that make huge sums of money just picking up hospital waste.
Right.
Well, where the hell
Yeah.
does all that go? You got all these parts you've cut out of people and stuff and skin and blood and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, are you guys just incinerating that? I don't know.
Yeah. So you touched on definitely an example of something that could be a small initiative, right? You can figure out ways to filter that coolant so that you can reuse it, cutting oil. Or you just figure out ways to reduce the amount of water that you consume, or you figure out a way to recycle the water so that you're buying less from the system. It can be as simple as changing out light bulbs. I mean, many companies that I go into these days, they still have old light bulbs in them that are very energy consuming.
Yeah.
And generally, in a very short period of time, a few lights here and there starts to add up to some pretty good savings.
Well, I love to see Walmart when they came and started putting solar panels on their roofs,
yeah,
and then opening up their stores with more lighting. And,
yep,
I've seen plenty of these examples. It just doesn't seem fast enough, soon enough, but I get it that it's very expensive to do. But it seems like most of them have made a creed or a motto, or I should say a creed, that they are going to start down this path, and you're starting to see some shifts in the way in which they operate.
yes,
And I think I commend people like Amazon, for instance, saying, "Hey, we're going to replace our whole fleet with electric vehicles." Well, I mean, there's some doomsayers out there that'll say, "Well, hey, you still got to generate that power somehow. Is it being
right,
generated from coal
exactly,
burning plants?" I mean, you can. It's whoever is looking at the cradle to cradle design that says, "Hey, really, how much more energy efficient is this going to be? Is it going to save how much in gasoline and resources
yeah,
versus what it's going to consume in electricity?" And I'm all for all of that, but I don't think sometimes, I think the decisions are made a little bit hastily because it does get a little greenwashed. It's like, hey,
yeah,
we got all
exactly,
electric vehicles, right? Well, is that really better or not? And I'm not saying I'm disagreeing with electric vehicles. I'm just saying it's a great thing, but I don't think they really look at everything.
It kind of reminds me of everybody was up in arms in New York City because the horse manure was piling up. So, the solution was the automobile. Well,
Yeah.
the automobile brought some other problems with it, right? And I feel like we're going to have some of the same impact with electric vehicles, because all of a sudden now we need all this battery production. What are we going to do with all these used batteries?
Where are we getting all
Like,
this lithium? There's
yeah, exactly.
there's kind of a theory about Putin's war that Ukraine has a ton of lithium and that's what he wants to get his
Oh,
hands on. So,
yeah,
I don't know what to think anymore. I just kind of let my listeners know this is kind of some of the stuff you should be talking about, right? So look,
exactly.
to wrap the show up, you got a great website. I want to let the listeners know it's Emmanuel Strategic Sustainability.com. That's Emmanuel Strategic Sustainability Sustainability.com. There's some free resources there. Can you mention the resources and what would you like to leave the listeners with relative developing a more humanistic way to lead, develop and foster associates and teams within organizations that are being led more humanistically?
Okay. So yeah, on the website, there's various podcasts that others that I've done, and a couple of TED Talks that I did on kind of reinventing the industrial manufacturing industrial complex, and one on humanist manufacturing. You can also find a graphic of the 6 phases, more detail. We actually didn't touch on the humanist commitments, but you can find more detail about what the 10 humanist commitments are that I based the book on. And then, if compelled, I encourage people to look at the webpage that talks about my book. And I'd love to have people buy a copy, see what they can do to implement any or all of it. That it's not an all or nothing sort of thing. There's a lot of different good suggestions in the book. And ultimately, I'd be happy to help organizations if they want to make this transition.
Well, and I think importantly, they can just reach out to you. There's an email and there a contact form at your website that they can reach out and contact you. Here's the book. It's not expensive. Go to Amazon, pick up a copy of this book. Joe is available to you to speak about some of the things we've talked about or even more. I think the challenge that we face today is a lot of people like, where do you start? And what I would say is Joe would be a great place to start to have a discussion. He's not going to charge you for the first discussion, to just talk with him and say, these are my concerns. These are my current values. This is what I'm trying to do. This is what I want to do. And he's going to be able to guide you and give you some more resources. And who knows, maybe you're going to hire him to consult you to do what you need to do. But Joe, it's been a pleasure having you on Inside Personal Growth. I think this journey for managers and leaders is about the personal growth of being more humanistic. Now, that whole personal growth thing means you have to embrace emotional intelligence. You have to embrace more compassion with your employees. You have to look at ways to have the values and mission and purpose of the business align with the values and missions of the individuals. They have to feel proud of what they're producing at the end, what comes off the assembly line, and know that what they're doing is good and they're contributing something good to society. All of these things lead up and culminate into an organization which is humanistic. And Joe, thanks for being on Inside Personal Growth and sharing some of that. Thanks for my listeners for hanging in and hearing the podcast. Any last words?
Just I don't care how technological we get, we're always going to need the human element. And the better we treat humans, the more we tap into that enormous pool of wasted potential, the better off we're all going to be. And that's the key thing I hope people take from this.
Inspiring, Joe. Thanks for your time. Thanks for talking about humanistic manufacturing and associated topics.
Thank you, Greg. It was a pleasure.